We begin our look at languages by visiting the island nation of Curacao. Located in the southern Caribbean Sea just off the north coast of Venezuela, Curacao has been a site of trade and interaction for over 500 years. Beginning in the late 1400s, Spanish explorers arrived on Curacao and interacted with the local Arawak population. In the 1500s, Spain and Portugal both used this as a center of trade, an axis for exploring and trading within the Caribbean. Later in the 1600s, the Dutch took over, and the Dutch introduced the slave trade to Curacao, which introduced a group of people from West Africa. So as these different groups came together, they needed a common currency to communicate. And on Curacao, the language of Papiamentu evolved. Papiamentu is what's known as a Creole, a language that forms as different groups come together and find a common language, create a common language so everybody can communicate. Oftentimes it starts as simply a pidgin or a temporary language designed for trade, but as the population becomes more settled and permanent, the need for a permanent language, an official language, evolves. And on Curacao, Papiamentu fulfilled that need. When we talk about languages, oftentimes we ask ourselves, how many are there? What are the different types of languages that we might find, or dialects? When we start to talk about families, we need to step back and examine language families. Language families are simply a collection of languages with common ancestors. The language that most of us speak as our first language is tied to the Indo-European languages. So 45% of all speakers around the world, their first language ties to this Indo-European language family. And you can see the tree on the right that reflects the different branches and the different families. What these branches reflect is a split from a historic common ancestor. I've highlighted the Romance languages here with Romanian, Spanish, Italian, and French. These languages all split off from Latin hundreds of years ago at the fall of the Roman Empire. So Latin was a formal, a dominant, a legal language that was established by the Roman Empire. As the empire spread, populations become more diverse, the languages began to evolve in these different localities. During the fall of the Roman Empire, there was no longer that unifying force, so these different languages, Spanish, French, Italian, Catalan, they all evolved differently over the last several centuries. When we talk about language families, again, we're looking at these historic roots. English is part of the Indo-European family. This Indo-European root is believed to have been established at least 6,500 years ago. Some theories push us back to about 9,000 years ago. And the early reason for the evolution of language was that agriculture was expanding. Farmers, nomads were spreading out, and they were looking for a common currency, a currency for interaction where they could trade. So the need for a language evolved thousands of years ago. When we look around the world, we see different language families and where they dominate. And these global distributions are often tied to these historic language families. So the language families in the Americas were introduced by explorers, primarily from Western Europe, between 1400 and really the 21st century. We see as we moved east into Asia, East Asia has a different language family than South Asia. South Africa has a different language family than North Africa. But generally, these language families evolved because of that common currency, that need to communicate, oftentimes for trade. When we look around the world, we should recognize that nearly 7,000 languages are currently spoken. But we have a few very large languages. On this graphic, you can see that we have 9 large languages that encompass about 40% of the world's population. Individuals speaking Chinese fill that largest cohort. So while we have Chinese listed here as just one language, there are many dialects within Chinese that make up that 1.3 billion. You'll notice on this slide that English is 339 million. We have, in America, nearly 300 million English speakers as a first language. We also have the UK. We also have different territories around the world. Arabic was a language that diffused out of the Arabian Peninsula, and one of the big catalyst for the diffusion of Arabic was the growth and the diffusion of the Islamic faith. When we look at the diffusion of language, it generally falls into a few different categories. We already established that agriculture, the agricultural surplus, the need to trade, was one of these triggers for early evolution and diffusion of language. Politics becomes a major player, a major catalyst in the diffusion of language. We'll look at some examples of empires and colonies where this is true. Today, economics generally drives the diffusion, adoption, and globalization of languages. And also religion. When, again, to repeat, Arabic was a key source for diffusing the Islamic faith. So as the Islamic faith diffused out of the Arabian Peninsula beginning in the 600s, it carried with it Arabic. Arabic was that common currency for the Quran, the common way in which people could communicate and read a sacred text. When we talk about linguistic dominance, we often understand that economic or political strength is oftentimes bigger than pure size. So while Spanish and Portuguese historically were major languages, the populations of Spain and Portugal were not that large relative to other major nations. So oftentimes economics could be a driving force for the diffusion of language, and also political strength. If a nation has official languages, that'll oftentimes limit competition and also provide for growth of that dominant language. The first example we'll look at regarding politics is that of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had Latin as its official language. What's known as Classical Latin was the written form of Latin. That was the legal form of Latin that diffused throughout the empire. Vulgar Latin is spoken Latin. So think about in the United States, we have not an official language, but we have a dominant language, that of English. As you move around the United States, you'll notice that people speak differently. They use different terms or they say words differently. These are dialects. It's the localization of language. When we talk about the empire and we look at Rome, we see that as the empire expanded and this common language, this common written language was established, people spoke differently in different parts of the empire. As the Roman Empire declined, and the stability, the support for a common language also declined, we saw these local dialects actually evolve into new languages. So over the last several centuries, we've seen the growth of what are called Romance languages, coinciding with the decline of the Roman Empire. So while languages like Italian, French, Spanish, Romanian, they have a common family based on Latin, they've evolved for centuries independently of each other. So today you have different dialects throughout the United States. You might have a New England dialect versus a Mid-Atlantic dialect versus a Southern dialect. Think about how these different languages could evolve over hundreds of years if our populations are separated and then they're able to grow on their own, independent, isolated from these other groups. Another example of language diffusion through politics is through colonialism. And the map on the screen shows us three different examples. The first one here is Argentina and the Spanish influence in this southern cone of South America. Spain was a colonial power in South America for hundreds of years, and as a result, Spanish language, Spanish culture diffused into this part of the world. Second example is Mauritania and the French legacy in that part of Africa. France was a colonial power in the 19th century into the 20th century, and as a result, many of the African colonies had two or more official languages. In this case, Mauritania reflects Arabic and also that colonial legacy of French. And our third example is Portuguese. Portuguese is found in Southeast Africa as a result of its colonial experience there in the 19th and 20th centuries. The maps on your screen now show the Partition of Africa, which took place in 1885 when Western European powers took control of Africa and split up different parts of the continent for their own colonial possessions. Obviously, this is some terrible short and long-term results as communities were divided, as opposing forces were brought together, as people were oppressed and subjugated. But we do see a long-term legacy of language that comes out of this partition. When these Western European nations partitioned Africa, broke it up, established these colonial positions, they used their home language for administration, meaning schools, courts, legal services, businesses were conducted in these legacy languages. So in West Africa, you see a dominance of French. In North Africa, you see Arabic, which withstood a lot of the European influence. You'll see pockets of English throughout Africa. You'll also see Spanish and Portuguese as these Western European powers in the 19th and 20th century partitioned Africa, laid claim to colonies, oppressed the local population, and instituted their languages. Our second look at language diffusion is economics. And economics, dating back to our example of Curacao, has persisted as a driving force for a common language. The term lingua franca means trade language. And I want you to think about what are some examples of trade languages today. Now, historically, we saw how the Papiamento evolved as Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, Arawak, West African didn't stand alone independently. Today, our common business currency is English. When we look at cultural globalization, when we look at the diffusion of culture and business and the growth of multinational corporations, English remains a driving force. There is a clear incentive to adopt English as your lingua franca. Today, 45 countries around the world have at least 50% of their population speaking English. This doesn't mean that it's their first language, because if you recall, fewer than 400 people around the world speak English as their first language, but people are adopting English. They're adopting English based on this economic incentive. So countries around the world where the native language in 2 or 3 partners may not be English, there is incentive there to adopt English, learn English for that common trade currency. This infographic represents the number of people learning English around the world today. And you can see that we currently have about 1.5 billion or 1,500 million English learners. So that incentive to incorporate into the global economy is a driving force for individuals to adopt English as at least a second language, but basically that lingua franca, the need to communicate for trade. So economics today is a driving force for the adoption of languages. You can see here the third largest circle is Chinese. And despite having the largest population in the world, despite having the second largest economy in the world, Chinese is not a driving lingua franca. We have more Chinese people learning English than we have English-speaking people learning Chinese. So that common trade currency today remains English.